I shared a post this week on making and maintaining meaningful connections. One of the tools that I use in my practice, in my exchanges, in my coaching, and my training is a publication called Reconciliation Through Conversation. It's essentially a playbook on how to have challenging conversations and the advantages of asking uncomfortable questions. So, the way it's formatted is that there is an assessment piece. So, really determining what do I need to further examine. There's an ask. You're asking yourself specific questions, and there are specific questions that are being asked of the communication partner. And then we get to the consideration. So when we're talking about an exchange in which you all are talking, you come to this particular point in the conversation and you just don't get it. They're not hearing what you're saying. You're not quite matching up and aligning with what they're saying. So there are some considerations that you can put into practice. The first one is, what have I done or committed to in seeking more information to foster a meaningful exchange? So what are you doing actionably? What are you committed to doing? And how are you using this to foster a more meaningful exchange? Are there opportunities to acknowledge the individual's preferences for terminology, conversation style, while still honoring my own? So sometimes when we're exchanging, we want that other person to say it the way we said it, or we want them to use particular language in the way that we would use it. Well, guess what? They have their own set of values, ideology, philosophy, experiences, practices that contribute to how they show up in the conversation and why they say it the way they do. I'm very interested in why people say things the way they do and why they respond the way in which they do in a conversation. I pay attention to that professionally, but also pay attention to that because I'm very much interested in just human nature and why people do things the way they do. So that's something that we want to examine and consider, especially when we're listening for certain things and we're wanting to get to a certain outcome in an exchange, and we're finding ourselves kind of at this particular place and we're not moving forward. So really thinking less about, okay, a person said it this way, reading between the lines. I'm used to working with folks who identify as neurodivergent. I'm used to working with folks who have had communication differences. And it's important to be able to read between the lines to really get to what a person is seeking to convey. And then another question you want to ask yourself is, are there opportunities to determine what works and modify what doesn't? So we're in this conversation, we're exchanging, we're finding ourselves at this particular juncture, and we're not quite moving forward. We're not quite moving past this particular place. Well, what am I doing to modify what's happening? What am I doing to better foster an exchange by thinking deeply about what's working and what's not working? I would encourage folks at this particular point to employ the power of pause. That means literally stop, pause, assess, think through what was said at this point, think through what your next point would be. Don't just keep going back and forth and trying to overtalk someone, or going back and forth and saying the same thing over and over, but in a different way. Really employ the power of pause. Sometimes it requires people to actually bookmark where they are in the conversation and return to it later, but you would decide in that exchange what that looks like for you. But simply empowering yourselves and employing the power of pause gives you an opportunity to be reflective and go back to that assessment piece. So this particular publication, the assessment, the acknowledgement, the ask, the consideration, the application, you can cycle through these particular steps and stages at any point in the conversation, because sometimes you have to go back to the ask. Sometimes you have to go back to assessing where you are, and then you move forward with the considerations. So asking yourself, what do I need to modify? What do I need to do differently in this exchange in order to move us forward? And then you want to find out, have I asked the right questions? Have I provided clear enough, accurate information? So it's not just about challenging someone during an uncomfortable exchange. It's about, am I asking the right questions? Am I phrasing things in a way or inquiring in a way that really gets me to the end goal? So that's a really important part in the stages of communication. And then there's the application piece, determining the advantages and disadvantages of maybe expanding your repertoire, maybe expanding more on, how folks communicate and how they show up in conversation and what more needs to be considered or done when it comes to different ideologies or different philosophies or different ways of speaking or code switching or ways of showing up. So there's so many different approaches when it comes to communication differences and really assessing that, asking the right questions, kind of employing the power of pause as you make those considerations, and then that application piece. So this is a tool I would strongly encourage you to add to your library, especially as you're exchanging and creating those really meaningful communicative relationships.